Dr. Bruce Bloom. I am the Chief Science Officer at the Kabuki Syndrome Foundation. We're glad to welcome you to today's webinar. We'll begin to answer the question, how many people have Kabuki syndrome? An interesting question for all of us, because at the beginning of the seminar, we had a poll that we let you take to tell us if you think Kabuki syndrome is more or less common than 1 in 32,000 people. This number is the most commonly quoted statistic for Kabuki syndrome prevalence, but did you know the statistic was derived over 35 years ago, and it was calculated before the genes related to Kabuki syndrome were even identified. And this statistic does not actually measure the prevalence of Kabuki syndrome in the general population, but when it was first discovered, it was the rate of Kabuki syndrome in live births in the country of Japan. This is a very subtle but important difference, and our keynote speaker will discuss this later in the hour. If we look at the results of the poll, which are popping up here, it looks like about 3% of our attendees think that 1 in 32,000 is an accurate statistic. We agree these statistics need to be revisited and updated, but before we get into that, let's go over what prevalence is and why this number and this definition is so important. So what do we mean when we use the word prevalence? Prevalence is defined as the total number of cases of a disease within a specific patient population at any particular time. So in other words, if there were 100 people in the population and 10 of them had a disease, 10 out of 100 is 10%, or 1 out of 10. So prevalence is calculated as the number of people in a sample with the disease or disorder divided by the total number of people in the sample. Sometimes prevalence is measured as 1 in a certain number of people, like the statistic we were talking about before, 1 in 32,000. But sometimes that makes it hard to compare prevalences between diseases. So epidemiologists prefer to measure prevalence as a number out of a standard like 100,000 or 1 million. If we convert 1 in 32,000 into the standard of 100,000, we get 3.125 people in every 100,000 people would be diagnosed with Kabuki syndrome. So that's something to keep in mind as we delve further into the data. So why is prevalence important? Because prevalence measures the burden of disease on a society. Now, when we say burden here, we're not saying that people with Kabuki syndrome are a burden, anything but that. This is the technical term that's used to mean the cost for individuals and communities that are associated with the disease. And we use this definition to do all sorts of things. So it measures these costs to society, and prevalence is used by policymakers and clinicians when making decisions about things like, how do we allocate resources? What do we do with public health planning? What kind of policy development is important as we think about individual diseases or groups of diseases? And certainly clinical care decision-making is important from a clinical and patient standpoint. So having an accurate prevalence statistic ensures we're able to maximize the resources that will be allocated to benefit people with Kabuki syndrome. And it ensures that people with Kabuki syndrome are represented when policy is made. So an updated accurate prevalence is also key to attracting partners in biotech and pharma, the ones that are going to help us to move therapies to patients. More resources can be allocated towards Kabuki syndrome, which translates to more attention and more funding. It's important to get both the right number to ensure accuracy and to show that the prevalence is as high as possible so that people are more interested and more attractive, both to academics and industry, hopefully ultimately leading to therapy development. For our community, having an accurate picture of how common Kabuki syndrome is will help us advocate for funding and provide more support where it's needed. So having accurate prevalence statistics for Kabuki syndrome is important for making sure the community is getting the resources we deserve, as well as to make sure that these resources are attracting industry and academia to prioritize Kabuki syndrome for therapeutic development. This is why updating the prevalence statistic for Kabuki syndrome is part of our LEAP activity for this year. So our strategic roadmap to find treatments for Kabuki syndrome consists of 4 arms: learn, enable, accelerate, and prepare. The acronym is LEAP. So LEAP is our strategic roadmap. And you can see we reached a lot of milestones in 2023. It was a momentous year for us, and we made a lot of progress. Here's a snapshot of all the accomplishments. We don't have time to talk about all of these initiatives today, but if you're interested, Kristen will put a link to our website in the chat, which she's just done, and you can head over there after the webinar is finished to learn more. Today, we're going to focus our initiatives that help prepare for clinical trials. So let's take a closer look at those under the prepare. Within preparing for clinical trials, we've identified 4 key programs. The first that we're going to talk about later today is launching Kabuki Count, our census and contact registry, which we'll talk about. Clara's going to talk about that in just a little while. Updating Kabuki syndrome prevalence statistics, which we'll dive into right after I'm done. We're also building patient data and sample repositories. We are planning to launch a new data repository later in 2024, and we've already begun collaboration with several groups, including Combined Brain, to establish sample repositories. And some people have already donated samples, which is great. And the last one is improving diagnostics, and we'll have a different webinar on that at a later date. Today, our main focus is on updating Kabuki syndrome prevalence statistics, and we'll also give you an update on Kabuki Count, our global census. And so we have some amazing speakers lined up. Our keynote speaker, Dr. Cynthia Willey, will show you the results of her report on the current state of Kabuki syndrome epidemiology, which was commissioned by Kabuki Syndrome Foundation at the beginning of 2023 to gain a clearer understanding of what is known about Kabuki syndrome prevalence. Dr. Willey will explain how the most commonly quoted statistic of Kabuki syndrome prevalence was calculated and what evidence we can use from the scientific literature to determine if this figure is accurate. Then our Director of Research, Dr. Clara Tang, will go over some of the roadblocks we've identified from Dr. Willey's report, and Clara will explain several projects we've initiated to overcome these obstacles. And we'll close with a talk from Amanda Gamboa, who will explain Kabuki Count, our global census and contract registry, and she'll give us an update on the data we've collected since its launch in October 2023. We're hoping this webinar is interactive, so if you have questions throughout the presentation, be sure to type them into the Q&A text box on your screen, and we'll do our best to answer all of your questions during the Q&A at the end of the webinar. If for some reason we run out of time, we'll make sure we'll email you the answers to your individual questions. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Willey, who is the Associate Editor for Pharmacoepidemiology for the journal Clinical Therapeutics. She's also Professor Emeritus of Pharmacoepidemiology at the University of Rhode Island, where she was on staff for over 31 years. She's a world-renowned expert in pharmacoepidemiology, which is the study of interaction between drugs and human populations, investigating in real-life conditions the benefits, risks, and use of drugs. This work not only includes work on the drugs, but also assessing patient population, including prevalence. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Willey.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So as Dr. Bloom said, I am here today to tell you the story of our investigation of the prevalence of Kabuki syndrome. Epidemiologists like myself, we often tend to think of ourselves as disease detectives. So together today, I'd let's try to think like epidemiologists as we look at the information that we have about the prevalence of Kabuki syndrome. So you've all heard this number quite a lot. 1 in 32,000 people have Kabuki syndrome. So the first step in our investigation was to find the source of this number. Finding it was relatively easy because it is cited in many, many medical journal articles. The number comes from a study published in 1988. The title is listed here. And after I found the article and looked in detail at it, I have to say I was quite surprised at the source of this figure. So the prevalence number was found by studying 10 patients identified from 1971 to 1986. Next, the authors assumed that only about 20% of patients with Kabuki syndrome would have been referred to the hospital. Then they calculated the prevalence based upon the number of infants born during that period of time. So two things should jump out at us when we look at this number. The prevalence figure is not prevalence in the population, not at all. It is in fact an estimate of live birth prevalence, which is very different from prevalence in the population. In epidemiology, there are many, many types of prevalence, and live birth prevalence and prevalence in the population are only two. So it's important for us to, number one, recognize that 1 in 32,000 is the estimated prevalence, not the actual count, but estimated prevalence among live births. Okay, so can we go to the next slide? So based upon this finding, the foundation thought, isn't there more recent information other than this one study in 1988? So that was our goal with this investigation, to provide more contemporary estimates. Let's see what else is out there and see if there's anything that we can compare this figure to. So I performed a worldwide literature search to identify all studies of the incidence or prevalence of Kabuki syndrome. In addition, as we'll discuss later, we contacted US registries that document information on congenital disorders. Okay, so we can move to the next slide. Okay, so this slide just basically describes the literature search for you. For those of you who are interested in this, you could go back to this later if you want, and you can actually repeat the literature search that we did. If many of you are probably familiar with PubMed, but if you're not, PubMed is a fantastic tool. Using PubMed, and just Google PubMed, you can find all published peer-reviewed literature in medical areas on any topic that you might want to investigate. So the approach that we used was to use these keywords shown here: incidence or prevalence or epidemiology and Kabuki syndrome. And we wanted to look at all studies published from the original 1988 study through the time period of our study, which was 2023. 73 studies were identified and 9 were selected for further review. So you're probably wondering, why only 9? Well, many studies use the keyword prevalence, even if those studies are just looking perhaps at maybe 5 or 10 individuals, and they might be looking at the prevalence of a certain symptom among those children with Kabuki syndrome. So there were only 9 that looked at populations. So remember, in epidemiology, we want to look at the occurrence of disease in broad populations. So that was a bit disappointing, only 9. So we expanded the review to include studies of congenital disorders thinking that more broad-based studies of a wide variety of congenital disorders might include information on Kabuki syndrome. And indeed, we did find a very good study from Italy using this approach. So the result of the literature search was 10 population-based epidemiologic studies, 4 provided prevalence in the population. And these prevalence estimates were in Europe, Spain, the UK, and Italy. 3 provided birth prevalence estimates like the original study. And among the 10, 3 were excluded, again, because they were not done in populations. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So first, I'm going to talk about the 4 studies that estimated the prevalence in the population. All 4 of these may have underestimated prevalence for various reasons. The studies from Spain and Italy included only cases that were in pediatric hospitals. So older individuals would not have been counted in those studies. The multi-country European study included only cases that were submitted to an online system that clinicians could use to help them diagnose rare diseases. Thus, we know in that study, not all cases would have been counted. And lastly, there was a UK study, which at first was very exciting to see because this UK study included all patients registered with general practitioners in the UK. And this study, unfortunately, was only able to count patients using diagnosis codes. So, and unfortunately, because Kabuki syndrome does not at this time have its own separate diagnosis code, its code is combined with other conditions, that study would have had to rely on doctors writing comments, so adding more information to the record. So we know that that study probably undercounted patients also. So let's go to the next slide and you'll see the results of these 4 studies. So this is what we're seeing in the 4 studies, and remember, this is not live birth prevalence. So this is different from, this is prevalence in the population. So this is different from live birth prevalence. Now, the European study and the UK study had rates of a little less than 1 per 100,000. There was a higher rate in the Spanish study. The study on the right, you're probably wondering why that block is so big, 8.6 per 100,000. Well, the reason is that that study calculated yet again another different type of prevalence, which is prevalence in children only. So, and we would call that an age-specific prevalence. And if you think about it, you know, if you divide by the total population versus just the number of children, you're going to get a bigger number when you look at age-specific prevalence. Now, they could have calculated the prevalence either way, but that was how they decided to do it in Italy. So I put this line here just so that we're very clear that we can't compare the 8.6 to the other numbers. And also, you know, keep in mind, we can't compare these numbers to the 3.1 per 100,000 that we saw in the original Japanese study. Okay, so let's move on to the next group of studies. So remember, now there were 3 studies that looked at birth prevalence instead of prevalence in the general population. So birth prevalence, as a reminder, is the number of live births diagnosed with Kabuki syndrome divided by the total number of live births during a specified period of time. The birth prevalence studies showed us that in Italy, the rate was about 2 per 100,000 live births. In the Japanese study, when we converted the 1 in 32,000 to a rate per 100,000, we come up with about 3 per 100,000 live births. And there was another study in Australia, and the result was 1.2 in 100,000 live births. Now, as I said before, unfortunately, we can't directly compare these numbers to the figures of the other studies. But we did, and I'll describe later how we did figure out a way to do that. Another point I'd like to make before we go to the next slide is that for many reasons, the data collected in these studies was more comprehensive than in the studies that looked at prevalence in the population. And reason being that these studies that looked at live birth prevalence had the advantage of having population-based registries from which they could get information. So in Italy, in Tuscany, there are two registries, a rare disease registry, as well as a registry of congenital disorders that collect data routinely on all congenital conditions in Italy. So this data is updated continuously, and we can have a lot of faith that they are comprehensive. Similarly, in Victoria, Australia, they were able to count all cases that occurred in the area of Victoria, Australia, because the genetics center there covered the entire area. And because they have a national healthcare system, we know that everyone in that area would have used that particular center. So for many reasons, the data collected in these studies is excellent and comprehensive. But unfortunately, we can't directly compare these numbers to these live birth prevalence numbers to prevalence in the population. So that was our next step. Again, as disease detectives, we wanted to figure out, is there a way? So now we can go to the next slide. Okay, so this basically summarizes the point that I just made. We have some studies that measured birth prevalence, and those were great studies, excellent at being comprehensive at collecting data. Some measured prevalence in the population. We think that those may have estimated prevalence on the lower side. Is there a way to estimate prevalence in the population from birth prevalence? We thought about this a lot, and in the next slide, I'll describe to you how we figured out how to do that. Okay, as epidemiologists, we often estimate prevalence from pieces of information, especially for rare diseases. It's often only possible to have a few pieces of the puzzle. And mathematically, we know there's a relationship between prevalence in the population, annual incidence in the population, and duration of disease in the population. So what do I mean by that? So annual incidence is the number of new cases occurring each year. Remember, we said prevalence is the total number of cases. As epidemiologists, we often use the term old cases and new cases. Very technical, right? So prevalence is old cases and new cases. Incidence is only new cases. Duration of disease is the length of time that someone with a disease or condition stays in the population. So it makes sense that prevalence is a function of the flow of new cases that come into the population and how long they stay in the population. So if we think about this and try to break it down further, incidence, that flow of cases into the population, the new cases, we can break that down into two components. Well, those who are identified at birth in these congenital registries, those are new cases. They're flowing into the population. Now, most of these registries, the one in Italy, for example, and the one in Australia, they record any diagnoses from birth to age 1. Okay, so we know that we have the new cases from birth to age 1 in those registries. And if we can estimate how many cases, new cases, are diagnosed after age 1, we can have that other component of incidence that we need to estimate the prevalence rate. So how did we do this? Let's go to the next slide and we'll start to look at that. So again, think of this as puzzle pieces. We're disease detectives trying to pull together these different pieces. We need to know how many children are diagnosed with Kabuki syndrome after age 1. So we did another literature review and we looked at large studies of Kabuki syndrome, and we found some consistency that in these large case series studies, they gave information on the age of diagnosis, and about 40% were diagnosed before age 1, and more were diagnosed later, about 60% later on. So we use this information to estimate annual incidence from the number of cases diagnosed at birth. So we inflated the number of cases diagnosed at birth to estimate annual incidence. And then again, going back to the literature, we estimated duration of disease. And that required another extensive literature search. And unfortunately, we don't have time to go into the details of that today, but there is a report with the foundation if anyone has interest in more of the details about that. So now, with an estimate of annual incidence, the flow of cases into the population, plus the duration of disease, we can estimate prevalence in the population and compare the published studies. So let's go to the next slide. So now we can look at all of the studies that looked at live birth prevalence, the studies that looked at prevalence in the population. But again, we have to remember that we can't compare the prevalence in the population, prevalence among all ages, with the prevalence in children. So we still have that line reminding us that we can't make that comparison. But we can now compare all of these studies to that number that we all had in our mind at the beginning, the 3.1 per 100,000. So 3.1 in the orange block on the left, that's the number from the original study. Remember, it's an estimate of live birth prevalence. And what we can see is that the prevalence in the population is actually higher in Japan. Once we convert that live birth prevalence to prevalence in the population, we get a bigger number, 4.8. So close to 5. In Australia, about 4. Spain, UK, and those numbers are lower. But again, remember that we think there are reasons for that. We think that the true number is really higher. The true number, we think, is more likely around the 4 or 4.8 number from Australia, Japan. And that and especially Australia. I have to say, the Australia study was very impressive because we know that they were able to be comprehensive in their counting of cases during the first year of life. So at this point in time, the number 4 per 100,000, 4 to 5 per 100,000 is what I was thinking was a good estimate for prevalence. So let's go to the next slide. So how does US prevalence compare? Well, one thing you might be very surprised at is that there are no published studies of Kabuki syndrome prevalence in the United States. None. Several in Europe, but none in the United States. However, after we completed this portion of the project, we went on to look at data from the United States based upon state-level active surveillance systems for monitoring congenital conditions. So just briefly, what active surveillance means is that in some states, they have systems whereby medical records abstractors are routinely reviewing healthcare records, hospital records, data systems. So they aren't waiting for someone to report a case to them. They are actively surveilling, actively looking for cases and adding those cases to databases. They code the cases with these coding systems, which are listed here. So what we did was we asked states that have these type of systems to give us the annual number of infants with codes that indicated that would include Kabuki syndrome, plus text annotation by physicians. Okay, so the physicians would have written in the medical record that the diagnosis code was Q87, and they would have given more detail that the diagnosis was Kabuki syndrome. In 2 states, it was also possible for these medical records abstractors to include cases based upon laboratory data within their data collection systems. And I'm just checking my time here. I think I'm a little over, but I'm going to finish up quickly and just summarize. So we saw prevalence was higher for the year 2020. We could hypothesize based upon this difference between the data from 2015 to 2020 and just 2020, that there may be recent increases, and it's possible that this is due to wider availability of genetic testing in recent years. Next slide, please. So finally, what did we learn? We learned that there's a wide range in worldwide estimates of the prevalence. Using the rate of 5.2 per 100,000, which is the North Carolina estimate, we estimate that a little under 18,000 diagnosed cases of Kabuki syndrome are estimated for the US. Unfortunately, with the data at this point, it's unknown how many might possibly be undiagnosed. But we also learned that going forward, state-level surveillance data can be helpful for estimating prevalence. But data from individual states might not be enough. Pooling across multiple states would provide a larger sample size, better estimates, and especially if this could be done for more recent data for 2020 and beyond may more accurately reflect true prevalence due to increased availability of genetic testing in more recent years. And finally, moving forward, there is a national network called the National Birth Defects Prevention Network. And this is a network of these state-based programs that document, track, assess changes in congenital conditions over time. And the Massachusetts Center is a member of this program, and they were very intrigued by our request for data on Kabuki syndrome. I remember them saying, no one's asked us for data on Kabuki syndrome before. And they were extremely helpful and volunteered to work with the foundation to coordinate further data collection among members of this nationwide system, which would pool data from multiple states and hopefully raise awareness and provide even better, more precise, more current estimates of the prevalence of Kabuki syndrome in the United States that can then be compared to the worldwide studies. So that concludes my description of the analysis, and I will be very happy to answer questions a little bit later.
Thank you, Dr. Willey. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise with our community. My name is Dr. Clara Tang, and I am the Director of Research at KSF. It's clear that finding an accurate prevalence statistic for Kabuki syndrome is not an easy task. Although this may seem difficult, now that we're aware of some of the roadblocks, we are already working to overcome them. I'm going to start by highlighting the issues we've run into and then tell you about 2 initiatives that KSF is taking on to overcome these obstacles. So calculating prevalence in a rare disease poses some unique challenges, and the first challenge is small sample size. As a rare disease, the sample size is inherently small, making it difficult to capture enough data. If the prevalence is truly 1 in 32,000 newborns or live births, you would need to look at data from at least 32,000 newborns to find even one case of Kabuki syndrome. So this requires we collect data from large populations. Another roadblock is fragmented data. Even after people are diagnosed, there is no central location for reporting this data. The data is scattered across different healthcare facilities, making collection difficult. And finally, a major issue for rare disease is non-standardized data. When Kabuki syndrome is diagnosed, there is no standardized code or way for clinicians to indicate that the person has Kabuki syndrome. So the data that is recorded is generalized or based only on symptoms, which can vary widely in Kabuki syndrome. This makes extracting data on Kabuki syndrome very difficult. Now that we have identified these roadblocks, we can develop some solutions. So for small sample size, because Kabuki syndrome is a rare disease and has a small sample size, it is important that we make sure that everyone who has Kabuki syndrome is able to get diagnosed as quickly and accurately as possible. We're working to improve diagnostics so that families can get answers and we can band together as a community because there is power in numbers. The details of this initiative are outside of the scope of this webinar today, but we will have a future webinar dedicated to this topic, so stay tuned for details on that. The issue of fragmented data is complex, but one way to compensate for data being scattered across healthcare facilities is to use the data from birth defect monitoring programs, such as the one that Dr. Willey mentioned. These programs consolidate data about health issues in newborns and can be used to better understand how many babies are being diagnosed with Kabuki syndrome in the first year of life. Unfortunately, when Dr. Willey was compiling the data for her report, she ran into roadblocks assessing this data. And to overcome this, we are working with the NBDPN Surveillance Data Committee to be able to access data, these surveillance data sets throughout the United States. The NBDPN is a group dedicated to birth defect surveillance, research, and prevention. The purpose of the Surveillance Data Committee is to compile multi-site data sets for pooled analysis. They are only able to compile data for a limited number of conditions, and we will be meeting with the committee in April to persuade them to select Kabuki syndrome as one of the disorders they choose to investigate. We hope that with the help of this committee, we will be able to access data that has been unavailable to us so far while Dr. Willey was compiling her report and lead to data that could be published, hopefully in the scientific literature. One of the other roadblocks we encountered were issues extracting data due to a lack of standardized data. It is difficult to extract Kabuki syndrome specific data because there is not a standardized way to report Kabuki syndrome in medical records. A solution to this is to apply for a Kabuki syndrome specific ICD code so that when medical providers diagnose someone with Kabuki syndrome, it will be recorded accurately. ICD stands for International Classification of Diseases and is a system of codes that are used by healthcare professionals to label, record, share, and track information about a specific disease. Each code corresponds to a specific diagnosis or medical condition. Every symptom in your chart has a specific code, except Kabuki syndrome. ICD codes are important for uniformity in medical records, which allows communication between healthcare providers, insurers, public health officials, and researchers. Right now, Kabuki syndrome does not have its own code. Most people with Kabuki syndrome are classed under other specified congenital malformations, which includes many other disorders. This makes it impossible for all of these entities to communicate about Kabuki syndrome. If there was a Kabuki syndrome ICD code, it would help healthcare providers communicate about care plans, facilitate approval for therapies and services through insurance companies, allow us to extract data about the cost associated with Kabuki syndrome, which would impact policy, leading to more resources. And it would also allow researchers to extract data for research. some of this data will be used to calculate prevalence. This is why KSF began the process of requesting a Kabuki syndrome specific ICD code last year. The road to getting an ICD code is long and usually takes about 18 months. Towards the end of 2023, we submitted a proposal to the ICD-10 Coordination and Maintenance Committee at the CDC for consideration. Our proposal has been accepted for discussion at the next committee meeting later this month. And during this meeting, Dr. Margaret Adams and a staff member of the CDC will present the proposal, sharing the clinical presentation of Kabuki syndrome as well as the proposed new codes and how it fits with the current ICD-10 CM system. Decisions are not made at this meeting. This meeting will be followed by a 2-month-long consultation period where there will be an opportunity for comments on the proposal. If our proposal is approved, it is possible that we could have a new ICD-10 code implemented for Kabuki syndrome in October 2025. As you can see, we have made a lot of progress in the last year on our mission to update the prevalence statistic for Kabuki syndrome. And if you have any questions about Dr. Willey's report or the other projects we've discussed, please don't forget to put them in the Q&A box. But before we get to our Q&A, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about Kabuki Count, our global census. And this project has been spearheaded by Amanda Gamboa, who is mom to Ripley and the Director of Communications at KSF. Amanda?
Thank you, Clara. I'm really excited to share our important project called Kabuki Count and how it helps us prepare for clinical trials as a census and as a contact registry. If we go back to our plan to prepare for clinical trials, you can see that in addition to having an accurate prevalence statistic, we also have launched Kabuki Count, our global census and contact registry. Let's first define what a contact registry is. A contact registry is a database that collects and stores information about individuals who have a particular condition. It includes names and contact details. Contact registries cannot be used to calculate prevalence, unfortunately, just because by their nature, they only record people who are opting in and they don't represent an entire population. Contact registries are important. They provide important information that tells us who is affected, where they are located, and we have a way to contact them. This information is so valuable when we are making decisions, about clinical trial design, site location, and recruitment. Our updated prevalence statistic will tell us how many people in the world have Kabuki syndrome, while a contact registry can tell us who those people are and where they are. And until recently, there was no centralized contact registry for Kabuki syndrome. And that's why we led an effort with 10 other Kabuki syndrome advocacy groups around the world and launched Kabuki Count in October of 2023. So why is this so important? Because how many people have Kabuki syndrome is always followed by how many of them can you contact. After our partners use the prevalence data to determine how much to invest and start designing a research study or trial, the next part is finding enough people to participate in that study or trial. Over half of clinical trials fail because they do not meet the recruitment goals. Simply not enough people sign up, partially because they're not aware of the opportunity. We need to be able to contact people with Kabuki syndrome, and that's Kabuki Count, our global census and contact registry. It's the database that stores your contact info and the key details that are relevant to research. We are showing our investors, academic researchers, government funders, and potential biotech partners the extent of our community reach. And we need all of these groups to be confident in our community outreach in order to move research to meaningful treatments faster. So together, an updated prevalence statistics and Kabuki Count provide a detailed understanding of where the people with Kabuki syndrome are most concentrated, which is so valuable when making those decisions about policy, research, and clinical trials. Kabuki Count was designed to be easy to use. We collect data using a simple survey that you can fill out at kabukicount.com, and it takes less than 3 minutes. If you haven't yet, now is a great time to be counted. Kristen's going to put the link in the chat, and you can head over there right now. And I'd love to share how many people have been counted so far. In 4 short months since launching on Kabuki Syndrome Awareness Day last October, we've counted 909 people from 48 countries. The top countries are US and the UK, and we also have substantial numbers from France, Spain, Australia, Canada, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, Brazil, Norway, and more. There's 48 countries. And I also want to share a snapshot of the data. When we look at the sex assigned at birth of the participants, we can see that we are almost 50-50 split between male and female. If we break this down further by the type of Kabuki syndrome, we do have more female participants than male participants in people with Kabuki syndrome type 2. We know, and this is interesting because type 2 is that KDM6A gene mutation and it's sex-linked, so it's on the X chromosome. We can't draw any conclusions yet from this data, but we think it's really interesting, and it shows us that these sex differences in prevalence are worth investigating. When we look at race, the vast majority of participants are white, which can be attributed to a variety of factors. One of these factors is language and accessibility to the forum and kabukicount.com. We are thrilled to share that the Kabuki Count webpage is now available in Spanish as well, thanks to volunteers from the AEFA Kabuki organization in Spain. We also know that our French partners are working diligently as well to provide the translation in French. And we'd love to hear from other groups who are interested in translating or being added as one of our partners in Kabuki Count. Go ahead and add a note in the chat or send me an email anytime. We're going to continue to work on addressing these barriers for underrepresented populations, and this topic truly deserves its own progress update at a later time as well. I'm going to now look a little more closely at the age of participants in Kabuki Count. We can see that the majority of individuals are under the age of 20. As Dr. Willey shared, genetic testing has become an option now, and it's even more accessible over time too. And we're seeing people being diagnosed younger and younger, but we also have folks who are in their 50s who are able to take a genetic test for the first time and be diagnosed. I can share a few more details, but I just want to assure everyone that these are just the participants we know of. There are more people out there with Kabuki syndrome of all ages. The oldest person we know of with KMT2D or type 1 that has participated is 58. The oldest type 2 KDM6A girl is 44, and the oldest KDM6A or type 2 boy is also 44 years old. And these are snapshots of data, and they are so powerful for the researchers who are exploring and planning clinical trials because the age of participants is highly controlled and pre-planned for eligibility in trials. And we are so excited to share these numbers with you, but the real power in this data is that it's going to help us drive clinical trials. Kabuki Count is the largest contact registry for Kabuki syndrome ever created, but we know there are still people out there who have not been counted, and we need your help. We want to reach everyone who has been diagnosed with Kabuki syndrome. If the 1 in 32,000 birth statistic is correct, which we're learning every day, right? But if we're going off that one, around 115 babies with Kabuki syndrome would be born in the United States every year. So you can help us make sure we meet and interact with all of these new families, and they are given the opportunity to participate in Kabuki Count. We're just asking that you share kabukicount.com within your networks, in the Kabuki syndrome groups, your social media, and meetups at the park. Help us spread the word so we can expand this grassroots effort and reach everyone. And if you haven't yet, please do head to kabukicount.com. We are making great progress with all of your help. All of the initiatives that we've talked about today are funded by community donations through KSF. We've used over $80,000 to support initiatives like updating the prevalence, advocating for the ICD-10 code, and establishing Kabuki Count and counting over 900 families. These efforts are all aligned with LEAP, our research roadmap, and they're crucial for preparing for clinical trials that are in the pipeline already. But there is more to be done. We've raised a total of $2.4 million in the past year and a half to advance treatments thanks to your generosity. Every contribution matters, and there are various ways to donate, including new tax relief options for UK and Canadian donors. Remember, some employers are also matching donations, and we're happy to help you navigate that. And I have a special announcement for our Canadian families. Through the month of March, any new monthly gifts that are made through CAF Canada, which is our fundraising vehicle, those are going to generate a $20 bonus. Kristen's going to put the link to our donation page in the chat. And that page includes a link to our Canadian platform, our UK donation platform, and several other ways to give as well. All right. With that, I am going to welcome all of our panelists back, and I'm going to invite Bruce to kick off our Q&A session.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you all.
Yeah, we have just a few minutes left and we have lots of questions. The first question is for Cynthia. Question is, how are individuals with genetic mutations classified as variants of unknown significance? How are they counted in this?
Excuse me, can you repeat that question?
Sure.
Bruce, sorry, I was...
Yeah, there's 3 ways of categorizing patients that have Kabuki syndrome, type 1, type 2, or variants of unknown significance. And the question is, are the patients with variants of unknown significance also counted? How are they counted?
Yes, they would also be counted because most of the data is recorded without access to genetic testing, based simply upon physician diagnoses. So if the data were limited to the results of genetic testing, we would be concerned that those might be missing. But the data, for example, in the US, in the active surveillance systems would include any child with a physician diagnosis.
And a little follow-up question was the next one. How have statistics of prevalence been established for KDM6A or type 2 Kabuki separately, or just for all Kabuki counted together?
Just for all counted together, to my knowledge, in the US, it is still early days, I think, to be able to accomplish that, given variation in access to testing. There may be more information from some of the European registry studies, and I would expect to see more of that in the near future.
Thanks. There's a question for Amanda. Do you know how old the oldest patient with Kabuki syndrome is? I think you answered that, but if you want to answer it again.
Yeah, so we've got boys and girls with KDM6A. It's actually 44 for both. And KMT2D, the oldest participant, is 58 at this time. I've got 6 new entries already, so those are live.
Great. Barbara Cavalieri asks, is there anything as parents or patients to encourage our studies in our states? So Cynthia and maybe Clara could answer too. Cynthia, anything that you think parents can do that would help states do a better job of collecting this data?
Yes, I think the first thing would be to determine what kind of registry your state has. Some states have no registry. Some states have what's called a passive registry, which means they simply wait for people to provide information to them. And other states have active registries, and that's what you want. So I would say go to the website for the National Birth Defects Prevention Network. See if your state is there. If your state is there, you're in good hands. If your state is not there, then write to your legislators. Ask for, states support public health to varying degrees. And it's support for public health that results in the creation of these surveillance systems.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah, and I just want to add, if that's something that we have a number of folks who are interested in, that would be a great project that KSF could provide templates for you to reach out to your local representatives. So that's something that we'll continue to explore, because we want to make sure that we're all working smarter and not harder. I know we're all busy parents as well. So let's look into that, and maybe we can get a template circulated and shared.
Great. Another question for Cynthia. We learned that there's 1 in 32,000 from the Japanese study. Also read that there's 1 in 86,000 from New Zealand and Australia. Could the statistics be influenced by local demographic factors?
Oh, yes, definitely. Definitely. I think, it's an intriguing question why the rate was higher in Japan, especially given that in Australia, the surveillance is more extensive. We have more confidence in that number. So clearly there are genetic factors that are influencing the rate. And, these types of comparisons provide information for the development of hypotheses and more in-depth studies.
Great. Clara, a quick question for you. If there's a new ICD code, will patients and parents need to go back and get a new diagnosis?
No, no. So the addition of a new code doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go back and get a new diagnosis. Healthcare providers will use the most appropriate code for your condition. as needed.
Great. All right. And then one last question for Cynthia, and then we'll answer the rest of the questions by email. Is the data gathered for children who do not survive past infancy also collected? Those that
Yes.
diagnosed postmortem, are they collected?
Yes, yes. There is, yes, the simple, quick answer is yes, and prevalence is calculated separately for the different categories.
Great. Well, we're at the top of the hour. This has really flown by. So much great information. Thank you, Cynthia, Clara, and Amanda, and thank you to our guests who gave us such great questions. There's a dozen or more unanswered questions. We will answer those and get back to you individually. And from we'll find a way to post all the questions and answers from this webinar somewhere on the website. Stay tuned for more webinars from us on a variety of topics. And we're really so appreciative that all of you joined us today. And thanks to all the people behind the scenes like Jessica and Janet and Kristen and Corinne that also were very instrumental in putting this together. And Cynthia, thank you for all your time and helping us gather this prevalence data.
You're welcome.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.